Imagine a warlord so ruthless, the ground itself seemed to bleed wherever he marched. Not a conqueror, but an executioner of civilizations. He didn't just win battle, she erased entire cities from the map. Men, slaughtered. Elders, wiped out. And the women, taken, claimed, silenced. This wasn't chaos. It was strategy. Cold, calculated, terrifyingly efficient. They called him the Khan of the burned earth, Genghis Khan. And today, we peel back the myth to expose the horror. Behind every victory was a woman torn from her home, a city reduced to ash, a system built on steel, fear, and blood. Stay with us, because once you see what really happened, you'll never think of history the same way again. Genghis Khan's empire wasn't just built on brute force, it was sustained through a cold, calculated system of control. At the heart of that system was a military strategy that blended ruthless pragmatism with unexpected flexibility. Enemies who surrendered were not always slaughtered. If they had skills, military, administrative, or logistical, they could be spared and absorbed into the Mongol ranks. This wasn't mercy, it was strategy. Genghis Khan saw value in utility, not in compassion. Central to this system was the Yasa, a strict legal code believed to be compiled from Genghis Khan's own decrees. The Yasa was born in the crucible of war and enforced through fear. It dictated everything from the distribution of spoils to battlefield conduct and internal governance. Disobedience meant death. Discipline was absolute. Despite its brutality, the Mongol system included a striking element of meritocracy. Talent could rise regardless of birth. A stable boy could become a general if he proved his worth. What mattered was competence, loyalty, and results. Nobility and lineage, while still influential, were not the sole paths to power. But make no mistake, this wasn't about fairness. It was about efficiency. The Mongol Empire operated like a war machine, and every cog had to serve a purpose. Justice was not the goal, control was. In Genghis Khan's world, law and war were one and the same tools to forge order out of chaos, and to ensure that no one, not even the conquered, was wasted if they could still serve the empire's relentless advance. The fate of women in the wake of Mongol conquests. In the brutal march of the Mongol Empire, women were rarely spared, not out of mercy, but because they were seen as valuable spoils of war. While the men of a conquered city were routinely slaughtered, the women, especially the young and beautiful, were dragged from the ashes of their burning homes. Torn from the arms of their dying fathers, they were treated not as survivors, but as property war prizes to be divided among the victors. These women weren't seen as people with names or voices. They were currency used to reward bravery, to seal loyalty, and to symbolize domination. Mongol warriors didn't hide their intentions. They believed that if a man could not protect his wife or daughter, then he did not deserve to live. In that cruel logic, a woman's suffering became the mark of another man's failure and another warrior's triumph. European women were particularly prized, not for who they were, but for what they looked like. Their pale skin and foreign features were considered exotic treasures. Being beautiful could mean a better chance at survival, but survival didn't mean safety. It meant servitude. A woman's fate depended entirely on how desirable or useful she was. To "let the soldiers enjoy themselves" was the phrase often used, a chilling euphemism that masked violence behind the language of indulgence. For many women, the end of the battle was just the beginning of a far darker captivity. There was no rescue, no peace, only possession. In the empire of Genghis Khan, concubines were not merely victims of war. They were currency, trophies, and tools of control. After each brutal conquest, the most beautiful women were selected from the wreckage, paraded before the great Khan himself. Some were given as rewards to loyal commanders. Others, the most striking and talented, were absorbed into the Khan's personal harem world that blurred the lines between privilege and imprisonment. Genghis Khan officially had 4 wives, but according to historical sources, he kept over 7,000 concubines. These women lived in isolation, veiled and silent, stripped of identity and choice. Yet they were not abused outright as a matter of policy, not out of mercy. but because they were considered valuable assets. Like prized horses or precious gems, they were to be preserved and perfected. They were fed well, kept clean, and even trained in music, poetry, and courtly etiquette. A concubine's survival depended on her beauty, her usefulness, and her submission. The more pleasing she was, the higher her chances of being favored and spared. But make no mistake, these women had no autonomy. They belonged to the Khan. Their voices were muted, their desires irrelevant. In this gilded cage, dignity was conditional. They lived at the whim of a conqueror, their value reduced to appearance and obedience. In the eyes of the empire, they weren't women. They were living property kept, polished, and possessed. Rare women of power in a world of silence. Amid the blood-soaked conquests of the Mongol Empire, where women were often reduced to property and trophies of war, a few rare figures rose above the chains of captivity. In the vast shadows of Genghis Khan's brutal empire, where women were often reduced to nothing more than prizes of war, one story stands out quiet, yet powerful. It's the tale of Kulan, a woman of extraordinary beauty who caught the eye of the great Khan himself. But it wasn't just her looks that made her unforgettable, it was her courage. Kulan had been introduced to Genghis Khan by a trusted associate named Na. Fearing for her safety on the journey, Na made the bold decision to shelter her at his own home for 3 nights before presenting her to the Khan. His intentions were pure, but in the eyes of a ruler as possessive and suspicious as Genghis Khan, the delay was unforgivable. When the Khan learned of this, he erupted in fury. To him, Kulan was already his property. He suspected Na of dishonor and swiftly ordered his execution. But what happened next was astonishing. She reminded history that even in an empire built on silence, one woman's words could still be heard. The forgotten ones, women left behind. Not every woman captured by the Mongols was spared. In fact, for those deemed too old, too plain, too injured, or simply unlucky, the fate was far more brutal. They were not taken into the royal harem. They were not handed to commanders as concubines. These were not just survivors, they were rulers, women who navigated the brutal world of conquest and carved out a place in history with sheer resilience and intelligence. One of the most remarkable examples was Terajine Khatun, the widow of Ugedei Khan, Genghis Khan's 3rd son. After Ugedei's death in 1241, Terajine did something almost unthinkable. In a world dominated by warrior mensch, seized power. For 4 years, from 1246 to 1248, she ruled as regent over the vast Mongol Empire. Her leadership wasn't symbolic. She wielded real authority, appointed key officials, negotiated foreign relations, and even orchestrated the election of her own son, Guyuk, as the next great Khan. But Turajine's story was the exception, not the rule. For every woman who found influence in the Mongol court, thousands more vanished into silence. They were concubines without names, servants without rights, and victims without voices. Their lives were not written into official records, their stories erased by time and conquest. Turajine's legacy serves as a haunting paradox, proof that even in the darkest corners of oppression, power could be seized, however briefly. Her reign stands as a fragile monument to female agency in a world that offered women almost none. It is a rare crack of light in a history otherwise cloaked in shadow. Kulan, a captive woman with no official power, dared to speak out. She stood before the most feared man in the world and pleaded for Na's life. With calm defiance, she told the truth that Na had protected her, not touched her. She begged for mercy, not for herself, but for the man who had shielded her from harm. Her voice, in a world where women had none, stopped the execution. In that fleeting moment, Kulan defied the system. They were discarded, treated as worthless scraps in a war machine that had no place for the weak or undesirable. These women were often subjected to the worst kinds of cruelty. Some were mocked, mutilated, or used for sport by soldiers drunk on power and violence. Their bodies became battlegrounds long after the cities had fallen. Raped repeatedly, beaten for entertainment, or paraded around as trophies of domination, Their suffering was invisible to the historians of the time and yet more horrifying than words can truly convey. Some chose to end their own lives rather than face what awaited them. Mothers drowned themselves and their daughters in rivers. Young girls threw themselves from cliffs. To them, death was not defeat, it was mercy. A final act of control in a world that had stripped them of everything. And for those who did survive, it wasn't truly living. They were dragged along with caravans like animals, starved, shivering through the bitter steppe, only to be abandoned when no longer useful. Their names were never recorded, their pain never remembered. These were the women history forgot, the ones who were neither wives nor concubines, but shadows of war, swallowed by silence. In the brutal world of Mongol conquest, beauty became a currency of war, and women, especially the young and the fair, were among its most valued commodities. After a city fell, it wasn't just gold, livestock, or weapons that were divided among the victors. Women were, too. Handed over like gifts, the most beautiful captives were presented to commanders and warlords as living tributes, symbols of valor and conquest. Their flesh became trophies of domination, their tears part of the spoils. This wasn't seen as cruelty, it was policy. To reward bravery, inspire loyalty, and display status, high-ranking warriors were granted access to the finest rewards of victory. The more beautiful the captive, the greater the proof of the warrior's success. These women were not seen as people with histories, voices, or dreams. They were adornments to power. To the victors, they were no different from gold goblets or jeweled swords, except they bled and wept. Their names were rarely recorded, their pain seldom remembered, and yet, behind every proud general who marched home in glory was often a woman, silent, broken, and stolen, given, like an object to honor a man's strength. It was not love, nor even lust. It was domination, ritualized and repeated. In the Mongol world, taking a woman was not merely indulgence, it was a declaration. I won. I conquered. I own. And the more beautiful she was, the louder that declaration rang across the steppe. Her beauty became her curse, her body a receipt of war. In the brutal world of Mongol conquest, where bloodshed was routine and human life disposable, a strange contradiction emerged. Some women, captured in war, were treated not as slaves, but as ladies. One Chinese envoy, attending a royal feast at Genghis Khan's court, was stunned to find himself seated beside Princess Liman and 8 concubines elegantly dressed, poised, and addressed with courtesy. These women weren't shackled or silenced. They laughed, dined, and conversed like noble courtiers. To the outsider, it may have seemed like a sign of dignity and respect. But beneath this polished surface lay a darker truth. This respect was not rooted in equality or human rights. It wasn't given because these women were seen as people, but because they were beautiful, useful, and talented. Their honor was transactional, conditional. The moment their looks faded or their usefulness ended, so too did their illusion of status. They weren't honored for who they were, but for how they looked and what they could provide. This is the great paradox of the Mongol harem. Women who lived in gilded chambers, dressed in silk, called ladies by courtiers, yet remained captives in every sense. Their elegance masked their lack of freedom. Their titles veiled the trauma of their capture. They were trophies, not wives, ornaments, not equals. And in the end, their temporary privilege was just another form of controlled dignity, stolen from the ashes of conquest, beauty stripped of autonomy. For Genghis Khan, war was not merely a means to expand territory or amass wealth, it was a deeply personal expression of power, domination, and ultimate male triumph. His most chilling belief, reportedly shared in confidence with his closest companions, was that the greatest pleasure in life was to crush one's enemies, drive them before you, and take their women as your own. To him, the act of seizing a woman was not just sexual conquest, it was symbolic victory. If a man could not protect his wife or daughter, he did not deserve to live. That was the brutal logic of the steppes. In this worldview, women became living trophies, proof that their captors had not only won the battle, but had destroyed the legacy of the vanquished. Taking women was an act of erasure, of humiliation, of rewriting bloodlines. It was not only tolerated, it was expected, even celebrated. Warriors who performed well in battle were rewarded with beauty, flesh, and obedience. The suffering of women was masked behind the language of honor and valor. This mindset, while horrifying by modern standards, was normalized during Genghis Khan's time. It was embedded in the culture of conquest and passed on through generations of warriors. Women were the spoils of war, not individuals with agency or rights. They represented shame for the defeated and status for the victorious. In this brutal moral economy, conquest was not complete until the enemy's women wept in the arms of their captors. History remembers the conquerors, their victories, their empires, their legacies carved into stone. But it forgets the women, the ones who were dragged from burning villages, stripped of names, families, and futures. Most of them did not die in battle, they simply disappeared. Some survived, but survival did not mean peace. It meant waking each day to a world of silence, submission, and pain. For them, living was not a triumph, it was a prolonged sentence. We tell stories of empires and greatness, yet rarely speak of those who bore the cost in blood and sorrow. The kindnesses shown to a few cannot cleanse the horrors endured by the many. A handful of powerful concubines rising to influence does not undo the screams lost in the wind. Their voices were never recorded. Their pain was never honored. Their stories, if remembered at all, were reduced to footnotes or shadows. But they mattered. Behind every victory, there was a woman whose life was shattered to make it possible. To forget them is to erase the most human part of history, the suffering that built empires, and the silence that allowed it to continue.